Colloquium. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Vish Saktivel. I am a postdoctoral associate at CMES, and I have the honor of hosting today's session. We have with us today Dr. Lizzy Berk, recently awarded doctor, so congratulations, Lizzy, who will be giving her talk today called Viral Subjects, Stigma, Civil Society Activism, and the Making of HIV/AIDS in Lebanon. Dr. Berk is currently serving as a CMES postgraduate associate and recently received her PhD in anthropology from Yale University. She also pursued a certificate in gender and sexuality studies during her doctoral work and holds an MA from Washington University in St. Louis. Her work focuses on issues related to gender, sexuality, time, and subjectivity in chronic illness. She has published with the Journal of Material Culture, Anthropology of the Middle East, and Social Anthropology, and is currently preparing her first book manuscript for publication. So Dr. Berk will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll move into audience Q&A. Please do type your questions into the Q&A box below as opposed to in the chat as your questions arise at any point in her presentation, and I will do my best as moderator to get to them in the time that we have for Q&A. Okay, so with that, the floor is yours, Lizzy.
Thank you so much. So thank you, Vish, for that lovely introduction, and to the Council on Middle East Studies for inviting me for this talk. And I just wanted to dedicate this talk right now to the people of Ukraine and around the world who are going to be hurt by the recent aggression. So today's talk is called Viral Subjects, Stigma, Civil Society Activism, and the Making of HIV/AIDS in Beirut, Lebanon. So I want to begin with just a bit of a brief on Lebanon. So this research that for this talk today was conducted in 2015, 2016, and then a long period, about 18 months in 2017 to 2018. So since then, the situation in Lebanon has gotten even more precarious. So these images here are of Lebanon before the port explosion and then after the port explosion. So in August of 2020, there was an explosion at the port of Beirut. Basically, with the knowledge of the government, an explosive material had been stored at this port, and it had been stored not safely. And when a fire started at the port, it ignited the explosives. This explosion ricocheted throughout the whole city, and many people lost their homes, businesses. A lot of people were hurt and killed. And this was, of course, in the midst of COVID. So I don't know anybody among my interlocutors, the people I interviewed for my research, my friends in Lebanon, who didn't lose either their home, their business, both, something like that. So it was very devastating. Before this even happened, in October of 2019, protests had started in Lebanon against the government and the sort of standard of living, basically. So then following these protests, the port explosion, COVID, there's been an economic crisis in Lebanon. So for example, when I did my research in Lebanon, the exchange rate for $1 was about 1,500 Lebanese lira. And the most recent that I checked was about 21,000 Lebanese lira. So the currency has lost a ton of value, and a lot of people have lost their savings. So the situation has become very precarious, and I wanted to acknowledge that the Lebanon of today will differ in those ways from the time that I did my research. So here's a bit of background on HIV/AIDS in the region and in Lebanon. When I first met Dr. Nasreen, who is one of the main physicians treating HIV/AIDS in Lebanon and an activist in the region, the first thing she said to me that I should know is that it's spreading. So the Middle East and North Africa region, I think for many reasons, but certainly for HIV/AIDS, we consider it as a region because it's one of these world regions, but things are very different from country to country. So in the region overall, there's less than a 0.1% prevalence among people 18 to 49. So it's considered a low prevalence scenario. But there's been a 52% increase in new infections since 2001. So this disease is spreading very quickly. 38% of people are on antiretroviral therapy, or ART, which is the global standard of care treatment for people living with HIV. And a lot of countries in this region actually deny that HIV/AIDS exists in their country. And there's also a high persecution of homosexuality, which is often linked to HIV. And I also want to highlight, though, that while this country is known for the persecution, this country and region are known for the persecution of homosexuality, as we can see with the recent events here in the US, this is not unique to the region. So my study is actually the first long-term social scientific study of HIV/AIDS in this region overall. There's been a good amount of public health work, but nothing from the social scientific point of view. So in Lebanon specifically, against all of this discrimination against people living with HIV and disavowal of homosexuality in the region, Lebanon has actually publicly claimed its epidemic. It acknowledges that HIV is in the country, and the government has worked with civil society to combat the social stigma contributing to the spread of the illness. So there's about 3,000 people living with HIV or PL-HIV in Lebanon. The population's about 6 million. About 90% of that is sexually transmitted. So we don't see transmission much via injection drug use or from any of the other ways, which I'll talk about in a second. About 60% of this population we estimate is on care, so is on antiretrovirals. We also see that about 70% of this transmission is between homosexual encounters, while 30% is within heterosexual. And we actually guess too that that homosexual number might be a bit higher, but perhaps people are afraid of the stigma to report. So Lebanon has managed to provide antiretroviral therapy free of charge to anybody legally residing in Lebanon. They've also ended mother-to-child transmission of the virus and transmission via blood transfusion and donation. They've also set up, in partnership with civil society organizations, voluntary counseling and testing programs for HIV and education and awareness campaigns. So here we have just a couple of these. The All Are Equal Regarding AIDS is a poster campaign from the National AIDS Program, which is part of the Lebanese Ministry of Health. And then the other one, I Can Give You Hope, Intimacy, and Voice, I Can't Give You HIV, is from a local activist who has made his status public. This is from social media, which is still a very, very rare thing. I actually think he might be one of the only people doing it in Lebanon and the region. And he's advocating for the U equals U, so the undetectable equals untransmissible global campaign. So my main research questions for this study were, how do those living with HIV/AIDS in Lebanon experience this illness in light of civil society activism to overcome social stigma? How do local meanings of sexuality and sexual practices rooted in their contingent gender constructions shape the spread of HIV and its related social stigma in Lebanon for people living with HIV, physicians, and civil society activists? Finally, how are the subjectivities of these healthcare professionals, civil society activists, and those living with HIV/AIDS fashioned? And what role do stigma and civil society activism play in this production? So theoretically, my research is in dialogue with various areas. So the anthropology of AIDS, which has a long history since the beginning of the epidemic, literature on stigma, the constitution of subjects via illness, links between lived experiences of sexuality and illness, and civil society activism. So here I like to draw on a scholar, Nguyen, who is an anthropologist who have studied HIV/AIDS in West Africa. And they've coined the term therapeutic citizenship, which denotes a certain type of citizenship in which individuals must make claims on the global health apparatus in order to receive care and treatment for HIV/AIDS. And these claims must be put forward by a certain type of subject who has learned to make themselves legible to this apparatus by talking about their experiences with HIV/AIDS in a confessional support group manner. And so Nguyen concludes that self-fashioning as a therapeutic citizen, while powerful, is first about individual survival and does not elicit belonging in a biosocial sense. And here he's drawing on Rabinow's notion of biosociality. So I've built on Nguyen's notion in Lebanon to try and understand how subjectivities are constituted around HIV/AIDS. What I found was that the biosociality situation in Lebanon is mixed. Some people do find that this becomes a part of their lives, a chance to connect with others. For other people, and probably for most people, the stigma is so strong that they don't want to even interact with other people who are HIV positive. So I talked to some people who might have even seen someone they know when they're picking up their medicine at the National AIDS Program building, and that other person will still deny that they were there to pick up their medicine, say they were getting it for a friend or something, because they're so ashamed of their illness, even though the other person ostensibly has the same illness. I'm also here drawing from Beal's work in Brazil on AIDS citizens. So he looks at how people living with HIV/AIDS become these type of AIDS citizens, in which you're connected to local and national AIDS policy organs, and you also undergo personal transformations and new relations. And I've certainly seen a similar thing in Lebanon, although I would argue that the situation is certainly more locally based than nationally or than internationally based. So we don't see a ton of intervention from, say, the United Nations or similar organizations. A lot of these are local organizations. So since the beginning of the epidemic, the anthropology of AIDS has focused on the ways in which social and political factors, and not only biological ones, shape the experience of HIV/AIDS around the globe. So we've understood AIDS as a social disease and not only as a biological one. And so to quote the now late Paul Farmer, he said that AIDS travels along the fault lines of poverty and inequality. And unfortunately, he said that toward the very beginning of the epidemic. That's still true. So recently, the anthropology of AIDS has looked more at this illness as a disease of the world system. So to see the ways in which capitalism, global health apparatuses affect HIV/AIDS. They've also paid more attention to intersectional concerns. So how do interactions with class, gender, race, ethnicity affect AIDS? And we'll certainly see that in Lebanon, especially with gender. So through all of this, there's been no ethnographic monographs on HIV/AIDS in the Middle East and North Africa region. There's probably about 40 ethnographic monographs about AIDS around the world since the beginning of the epidemic, but my work will be the first long-term study for this region. So further, discussing stigma, I draw here on Alonso and Reynolds to argue that stigma is not an ontological state. So it is historically, culturally constructed. And often this is linked to, the stigma is linked to many factors. So injection drug use, in some places, notions of witchcraft or scent illnesses, always blame and accountability, moralizing, and notions of sexuality. And we find, unfortunately, all of these in Lebanon. We also note that stigma is emergent, which I certainly found in Lebanon. So it's an emergent property, meaning it's not something that we say was established at this date and is constant through time. It continues to develop. We often also find that the stigmatized play a role in their own subjugation. They accept the normative social boundaries and behaviors that they have evidently transgressed. And again, unfortunately, we see this in Lebanon as well. So often here, I'm drawing on work by Marcia Inhorn, who finds that as far as infertility in the Middle East, which is also a very stigmatized condition, especially among men, when we medicalize this and say there could be a treatment for it, it actually helps remove some of this stigma. And I found the same for people with HIV. Once they think of it more as a medicalized illness, and often in feminist studies, we are critiquing the medicalization of illness, but I think in this case, it can actually help. So work on sexuality in MENA is still a nascent field, though much has been done for a long time. There's been work done for a long time, but I would say it's still growing now. So there's been more recent interactions with feminist and gender theory and queer theory. Masculinity studies has also increased recently. And in Lebanon specifically, people have examined the lives of gay men. There's also been some recent work, very recent work actually, since I began my research on gay lives in Palestine and in Turkey. So in Lebanon specifically, people's work tends to focus on the urban, so on gay male lives in Beirut, which unfortunately was the same case for my research, which I'll talk about later. And so in none of these books do we understand anything about HIV/AIDS or construction of sexuality overall. We still see gender often as code for women. So I'm doing research on gender in the Middle East, often means code for women. And there's little work on framings of sexuality. So I argue that by shifting the focus of the work on queer lives in the Middle East and North Africa to the construction and practice of sexualities as they relate to illness and risk for illness, my research has the potential to add a new component to theories of sexuality performance in the region. I also think that by investigating the relationship between civil society activism, stigma, and HIV/AIDS, my research can test and generate new theories on social belonging as they relate to stigmatized health conditions and activism. So some findings from my research. Today's talk will focus more on people living with HIV, but I wanted to mention some of my findings on the civil society activists and physician groups as well. These are the three groups that I researched. And perhaps we can talk more about them in the Q&A if people have questions. So from civil society activists, we learned that HIV/AIDS in Lebanon is shaped in both material and discursive ways by their actions. So there's been harm reduction and medical outcome work done since the early days of the epidemic, so since the 1980s. And I think the care experienced by people living with HIV has actually made their lives healthier and happier. There's also a sense of community among the activists themselves that I would argue has allowed them to continue some often very difficult and very thankless work, and to inspire future generations of activists to continue this work. Unfortunately, the most recent and increasing bureaucratic requirements of activism are believed by these activists to inhibit their main mission, which they understand to be service provision to people living with HIV and their advocacy mission for education and awareness. Finally, this work done by activists has actually mitigated the stigma and discrimination faced by people living with and treating HIV/AIDS. And this has empowered the next generation of activists, many of whom are living with HIV themselves, which was not the case with the earliest activists. So I actually argue that this work against stigma and the care provided by these activists and their own empowerment have helped stem the tide of HIV/AIDS in Lebanon. In global health literature, we often see the argument that the region overall has a low rate of HIV because it's so religiously conservative or culturally conservative that a lot of the behavior that can lead to HIV just doesn't happen. And while that might be true to some extent, I would actually argue that, at least in Lebanon, this activism work has been what's helped to stem the tide. With physicians, I found a lot about care. So it was created in interaction with their patients, and they went far beyond simply being physicians. So they helped them face stigma in their daily interactions, as well as in broader places like in the media or going to conferences. Physicians were also very honest with their patients, talking to them about their sex lives, for example, or other things that might be stigmatized. They even went so far as to help patients with costs of care if they could, and being available to them to answer questions outside of office hours. So in this care nexus, both physicians and patients' subjectivities are shaped, and patients come to understand themselves as partners in their treatment and as more responsible for their lives with HIV. Physicians also become political advocates for these issues, like stigma, for example, that affect their patients' health and well-being beyond the biological. So people with HIV help us understand why it's important to study HIV and other sexual health issues in the region, which, as I mentioned, have been understudied in the past. They also teach us about stigma through these tropes of stigmatized sexualities and precarious chronicity, which I'll talk further about. So first, I want to share the story of Aline. She's one of my interlocutors, and she actually, it was important to her that I use her real name when I talk about her in my research. So while Aline was in the hospital following her diagnosis with HIV/AIDS, she received a box of Kinder Surprise. So that's like a chocolate that's popular in Europe and also in Lebanon. And a group of Transformer toys came with this Kinder Surprise. Aline set them up in her hospital room. She imagined them standing guard on her nightstand and fighting the HIV that was attempting to destroy her body. So uniquely among those people with HIV I interviewed, her case had advanced to the age stage of infection by the time a physician diagnosed her. She had been in and out of hospitals for years and was quite severely ill before she finally learned why. She spent months in the hospital following her diagnosis as she was so sick and became very depressed. So Aline is a lesbian, itself a marginalized subjectivity even within the queer community in Lebanon. There's a nearly 0% chance that HIV can pass between females during intercourse. As such, Aline believes it is actually the taboo and uncertainty associated with this illness in Lebanon that caused people to feel so anxious about her diagnosis. She's sure that none of the doctors she visited over the years, while the HIV was winding its way through her immune system, tested her for it because, quote, I'm a woman in Lebanon. She also didn't think about it as a potential diagnosis for herself. So when the doctor came into her hospital room one day and asked her mother to leave, she knew it was something about HIV. Since her diagnosis, the foundation of who Aline is haven't changed, but HIV has made her see what's important, quote, life is important and fuck everything else. Before her longest stay in the hospital, Aline had been a workaholic. Now she says she works only 8 to 9 hours a day and has learned how to say no. She feels like she's finally getting her energy back and has begun to go out with friends and drink and socialize again. She's also been working with one of the civil society organizations featured in my research. And it's this congeries of civil society, support from her friends and family, and her own agency that Aline credits with her beginning to feel better. When she learned that she would receive her HIV treatment for free from the Lebanese government, she felt cared for. She was shocked that this system worked so well in Lebanon and felt like, quote, with all of this chaos and mess in this country, at least the very important thing is there. Aline fears that at some point she will become immune to her HIV medication and that she might then contract other illnesses. She also fears that she will never be able to have a normal romantic relationship. She worries about she and her partner's ability to have a normal life and a normal sex life. It would certainly be easier in some countries, but she feels that her treatment is going very well in Lebanon, her family's there, and she likes it there. She wants people to know that it's okay to have HIV. There's support in Lebanon, but not enough people know about it. So in Eileen's story, we can actually see many of the themes that came up in my research with people living with HIV. So first, her female gender undoubtedly played a role, if not the defining one, in the delay in her diagnosis. Next, she shared her fears around engaging in and maintaining romantic and sexual relationships while dealing with the stigma associated with being HIV positive. She also expressed her uncertainty around planning for her future in a place she loves, in which she has care and support, but which also marginalizes, negates, and stigmatizes her choices and even her very being. So people living with HIV in Lebanon. I argue that their subjectivities cannot be reformulated following diagnosis with HIV without reference to the local forms of stigma associated with HIV/AIDS. They also help us think more about subjectivity, like I said, and stigma. So concerning stigma, the main ways that people renegotiate their subjectivities following diagnosis are through the analytics I developed of sexual subjectivities dealing with stigmatized sexuality and timescapes, for which I call precarious chronicity. So concerning stigmatized sexualities, this is an embodied subjectivity with which those living with HIV in Lebanon encounter and negotiate their sex lives. So these people living with HIV are discriminated against by society at large, often their closest relations, and structurally, such as by insurance companies. So this discrimination becomes quite acute in the context of sexually intimate encounters. So for many of my interlocutors living with HIV, whether and how to tell potential sexual partners about their illness was often on their minds. So like we saw for Aline, even if biologically there's not much danger, the stigma made it often be on their minds. So these people's sexual identities and practices could not be constructed or reconstructed, performed, without regard to the stigmatizing illness. So this is not to say that any of my interlocutors, if asked about their sexuality, would define it as stigmatized. It's simply a theoretical trope that I offer to describe the nature of the sexualities I encounter. So these sexualities are stigmatized in that, due to the stigma associated with living with HIV, any sexual encounter or potential sexual encounter is always already structured by this stigma. People cannot embody or enact their sexualities outside of the framework of HIV-related stigma. So while HIV-related stigma most prominently rises to the surface following diagnosis, it is constructed throughout people's lifetimes from various sources. And so here I have a list structured by sex education, the experience of coming out, talking with potential or sex partners, pleasure, specifically concerning condom use and drug use. And so a lot of my interlocutors, for example, when I would ask them about diagnosis with HIV, would start their stories about when they came out as gay. And this was not the question I had asked. It was just clear to me that that was very linked in their minds and in their experiences to their experience with HIV. So non-normative sexualities, and along with them HIV/AIDS, are often marginalized and stigmatized from early encounters with formal and informal sex education. And many of my interlocutors also face stigma and discrimination when they came out as gay, or even if they weren't out but were thinking about coming out and felt these acutely in sexual encounters. So my focus here on pleasure is to focus on pleasure as an analytic. Anthropology, in conversation with gender and sexuality studies, has paid some attention to pleasure seeking in the study of HIV/AIDS, though I would argue that it's concentrated more on deconstructing the category of risk behavior or the ways in which risk groups are comprised. There was a previous examination of pleasure in actually the International Journal of Drug Policy. So it came more from a public health point of view, but still a social science point of view. And their examination is born largely out of the conspicuous absence of this variable in studies of HIV/AIDS. So much public health or global health work on HIV/AIDS focuses on harmful behaviors, such as sharing equipment during drug use or not using condoms during intercourse, and potential interventions for correcting these behaviors. And while I'm not saying that we should stop focusing on these things, I'm saying that we should also consider the notion of pleasure seeking that might have instigated such behaviors in the first place. So the entanglements of harm/risk and pleasure were actually very replete in my study of HIV/AIDS. So for example, Dr. Hassan, who was one of the infectious diseases physicians that worked with me on my research, speaking of serodiscordant gay male couples, so where one is HIV positive and one isn't, that he treats as patients in Lebanon, he said, quote, "They are very well informed about HIV's transmission routes and always remember to use condoms." And then he laughed and said, "Except when they're high." So one of the men living with HIV I interviewed for my study told me that condoms feel like shit, especially if you're gay, because they're not made for anal sex. It's like trying to fuck something through a garbage bag and is a frustrating sexual experience. If you're a bottom, they rip you up. So these quotes demonstrate first the very basic idea that for many people, especially perhaps those engaging in anal sex, condoms ruin or greatly decrease the pleasure they sought from these experiences in the first place. They also demonstrate the link in Beirut between condomless sex and drug use, which according to my research often occur together. And this is also not a unique context to Beirut. It seemed to be more of a global thing as well. So among my interlocutors, which were largely men who have sex with men, it was common knowledge that condoms can help prevent transmission of HIV and other sexually transmitted infections. Nevertheless, they did not always use them. One of the reasons for this lack of use was being high in contexts where sex occurs. So one of my interlocutors told me that because people enjoy having sex without a condom, they don't use them. So it's not that they don't know they're supposed to use them, it's that it's not enjoyable. So he explained that, especially for gay men, and then he said, "I'm going to translate the term from Arabic. I want to feel you." In Arabic, it's like bedihas fik. It's like, I want to feel you inside of me without having a piece of rubber. Some people use the term, "I want to be one with you." I want to have sex with you without a condom, basically. Bedna nkun wahat. Khalas, we have to be in one bind without anything that could separate us, and that's having sex without a condom. He also tells me that the idea persists that if you ask someone else to use a condom, they will think you are not clean. So another of my interlocutors tells me that he'd like to use drugs sometimes as, quote, "I like it and I've gotten the worst disease ever, so I don't want to deprive myself." The information he's received from official sources, like civil society organizations and physicians, tell him that abstinence is the only way. So no cigarettes, no nargile, no casual drug use. His physician even told him that this use could affect his treatment. But he says he has many friends who are HIV positive, who also use drugs or smoke just casually, and they are still healthy. So the idea of cutting everything out for him causes a lot of anxiety. Further, a couple of men in their late 20s and early 30s who participate in the chemsex scene help me understand what this lived reality looks like. So chemsex refers to a scene in Lebanon, in Beirut specifically, in other places around the world as well, where men will get together, take drugs, and have sex. So my interlocutors told me that when people take drugs and have sex, they often lose any inhibitions and they engage in bareback sex or other risky behaviors. HIV doesn't come up because it's, quote, "the most turn-off conversation ever." But sometimes people ask, sometimes people answer, and sometimes people lie. And further, I would argue that for women like Aline, who has told me that she's had some sexual encounters that were not totally consensual, there's also a gender difference whereby women might not have the agency to negotiate condom use in the same way that men do. So I think that a lot of this information can be hard to hear, as often there's a desire for people with medical conditions to be somehow more moral than with people without them, and to make caring for the illness the center of their lives. So what these men can teach us is that while we do have to understand the ways in which these subjectivities are reformed following diagnosis with HIV, we cannot continue to place moral absolutes on these men or deny their agency by asking them to somehow be other than human, to abstain from everything that gives them pleasure, especially as one of them told us while they're already sick. So there's also some men in my study who assumed that they would contact HIV at some point in their lives, and so just wanted to get it over with. It was not the level yet like we see in the US with the, quote, bug chasers, but there is this air of inevitability. And so we can talk more about that in the Q&A if people are interested, but I thought it was an interesting point. So as concerns precarious chronicity, this is an intellectual trope I offer to help us understand the timescapes of HIV/AIDS in Lebanon and how they're renegotiated following diagnosis, both daily and more long-term ways. So we often treat chronicity as biological, when it is in large part socially constructed. This precarity manifests regarding life with HIV in a reluctance to make long-term plans in Lebanon, and in quotidian life beyond the idea of one pill a day. So the antiretroviral treatment is one pill a day, and there's a lot of support for this idea. It is a great idea. It helps a lot, but my interlocutors are saying that there's more to it than that. So precarious chronicity speaks to the unstable ways in which those involved with HIV/AIDS in Lebanon experience this illness, and it problematizes the notion of HIV as a chronic illness in a context in which chronic is always already perilous. So precarity in Lebanon, just living in Lebanon at all. People living there encounter uncertainty regarding the availability of electricity, access to clean water, inconsistent transportation, and unreliable infrastructure overall, sometimes oppressive military forces, and discrimination based on various identities. And like I said, a lot of this has become compounded since the port explosion and the economic crisis. So further, many people have a large number of social obligations, both to family and friends, and they work long hours. And this work has again become compounded because of the economic crisis. So they're constantly trying to balance all of this, which could include frequent visits to their natal villages outside of Beirut and very uncertain traffic, let's say. Finally, Lebanese bureaucracy can make some tasks seem almost comically absurd and take very long, but they also might take 5 minutes. You just never know. So to experience anything resembling a chronic health condition then is to experience it in the context of this already daily and long-term uncertainty. So specifically concerning HIV/AIDS, precarity involved a lack of certainty about how much medication one will receive at each appointment. So people go to the National AIDS Program building to receive their medication. This building was actually destroyed in the port explosion. And they might receive a month of treatment. They might receive 3 months because the medication is brought in from outside. They're never sure. A lot of my interlocutors also expressed to me their interest in health and nutrition before they were diagnosed, and they want to maintain this after diagnosis, but it becomes much more difficult. They're also often concerned that a job or a family member might discover their diagnosis and alter their livelihood or living conditions. So maybe they would kick them out of the house, disinherit them, fire them from their job. So daily experiences of people living with HIV. One of my interlocutors told me he's used to the stress of living in Lebanon, and it's actually become part of his daily routine. Another tells me that while the medication is available for free, getting help is never easy. For example, if I go to an organization, it takes 2 to 3 trips to get an approval. If I'm taking the test, I must go in more than once for the results, and the Ministry of Health charges me each time. I have to get this done every couple of months, but it's difficult to take days off of work every time. I'm not exempt because of my disease. As far as long-term planning or thinking about the future, there was a general reluctance to do so in Lebanon in general, and even compounded more for those living with HIV. So fear actually became one of the big themes of this, which we saw with Aline. So for me in particular, I attended a workshop put on by one of the civil society organizations I worked with in Lebanon. There was a training by a local psychologist who was trying to help people who work with people with HIV, how to address their fears. So he had us all write a fear on a piece of paper. We went around the room, put them in a jar, and then we picked one out of a jar and read it and practiced helping each other address these fears. So these can be anything from, I'm afraid of spiders to I'm afraid my mom will find out I have HIV. What happened though, was I would say at least half of these fears were focused on people who were worried about having to spend the rest of their lives in Lebanon. So these are people who have jobs at these civil society organizations, are all university educated, many educated abroad. A lot of them did experience discrimination because of their status as queer, but they were not the most vulnerable people that they were trying to help at their own organizations. They were often fluent in many languages, and this whole training was conducted in English and not for my benefit, for the benefit of everyone in the room who were all Lebanese. So what they found is that they're caught in Lebanon's position as not quite developed enough, but also not quite underdeveloped enough. So they couldn't claim refugee status or asylee status in other countries as having been persecuted for their homosexuality or HIV status, but they were also not able to travel freely as a citizen from a country such as the United States or Canada. So to describe HIV as chronic in Lebanon is to obscure the nuances of what this chronicity looks like day to day and the ways in which individual subjectivities are shaped around it. HIV/AIDS in Lebanon is most often not seen in acute crisis stages, and experiences with it do not resemble contexts around the world in which medication is unavailable or people are uneducated or unwilling to address the situation. It is in this vein, Lebanon is not quite a crisis, but also not quite a regulated situation as seen in other pockets of the globe, but I describe a life around HIV/AIDS as precariously chronic. So directions for future research. I certainly think that continuous research is very important. So simply continuing to go back, especially again, since this economic crisis and the pandemic and the port explosion, and continuing to do research on this same topic. I would also encourage any scholars who are interested in the region or even themselves from the region and broadly interested in questions of gender, sexuality, and health to look at these issues in their own countries. Like I mentioned before, Lebanon is the particular case for the region. And while a lot of the civil society organizations I worked with do have regional partners, the situation differs a lot in other countries. I also think for Lebanon specifically, research outside of Beirut is badly needed. While a lot of the civil society organizations dealing with HIV/AIDS and healthcare, and I would say queer life, are centered in Beirut, there's still plenty of things happening in all of these realms outside of the main city. And that research would be very important to help us understand how subjectivities are renegotiated following diagnosis in other places. Additionally, a lot of the work done on queer lives in Lebanon has been focused on Beirut. I think it would be wonderful to do some research among friends and family of those living with HIV and see how their subjectivities are renegotiated and how care is incorporated in their relationships. There's been a good amount of public health work done among vulnerable populations, such as Syrian refugees living in Lebanon, but more of this work from a social scientific perspective is badly needed. It would also be helpful to spend more time with physicians and even others working in healthcare to understand further this care relationship and perhaps how bureaucracy is influencing it. Finally, a more comprehensive look at Lebanese media overall. So there's been people like gay characters in soap operas or certain newspapers, Instagram accounts, could offer very important insights into how stigma is constructed from a media place and therefore how it might be reconstructed around HIV/AIDS and related issues. So brief conclusions. People living with HIV help us understand why it is important to study sexual health and related issues in the Middle East and North Africa region. They also teach us about lives lived in relation to felt, structural, and internal stigma. Through the analytic of stigmatized sexualities, the sexual lives of people living with HIV in Lebanon can be understood as always already lived in conversation with stigma. In addition, through the trope of precarious chronicity, people living with HIV show us how time as an aspect of their subjectivity shifts upon diagnosis. Next, and overall, I conclude that if policymakers and those working with HIV/AIDS in Lebanon can understand not only that the disease is stigmatized, as that is well established, but the ways in which people are remaking their personhood in light of diagnosis, care, and activism, they might be able to continue preventing infection and making the lives of those living with, treating, and advocating for HIV/AIDS healthier and happier. Thank you very much. And now I'm happy to take any questions anybody has.
Thank you so much, Lizzy. Your talk was really illuminating and also very important. Before I open it up to the audience, I thought I would just kind of kick off with a sort of first question. You gave us a really kind of textured picture of the experience of HIV/AIDS and perhaps chronic illness more broadly in Beirut, and you painted a really rich portrait of one set of your interlocutors, those living with HIV/AIDS. But I would be curious if you could tell us a little bit more about another set of people, the doctors and caregivers that you might have encountered in your research as well.
Great question, thank you. So I would say one of the things I found with the physicians in particular, as well with the civil society activists, but with the physicians, was that what they refer to often as bureaucracy or all of these demands of the healthcare system in Lebanon was actually hurting their job. So they couldn't care for their patients the way that they understood they were supposed to, or do the jobs that they believed they had sort of signed up for when they became physicians because of the system. So they felt like they were spending all of their time, filing reports or writing down what they just did, or working on trying to get funding for their patients instead of being able to do their jobs. And I would say, like, very similar as well to the United States, the healthcare system itself in Lebanon causes a lot of harm. So it's a pay system like in the United States, and this leaves a lot of people out. There's lots of different insurance schemes you can be on, some of them good, some of them bad, and this harms a lot of people, certainly those living with HIV, but people in general. And this was reflected to me by the physicians. We even had one person who a couple, but one in particular who wanted to come for an interview. And we were, meeting them at the hospital, and basically because they were so afraid of stigma that they had received from healthcare, that they didn't end up coming because they were so afraid. So there's also a lot of stigma that people receive from physicians, but from the healthcare establishment overall. As far as the civil society folks, an interesting thing I noted there was this generational shift. So a lot of the original civil society organizations, all of them, were founded by people who are not themselves HIV positive or part of the queer community, which is usually related to HIV in Lebanon. But they just basically wanted to care for their people or for their neighborhoods. And a lot of this advocacy came out of the civil war that happened in Lebanon from 1975 to 1990. And so recently, because I think a lot because of this activism work and making people feel empowered with their own status, people living with HIV or gay people themselves have felt not only empowered to come out, but to found their own organizations or to work with people like them. So there is this like generational shift among HIV activism.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, so I'll take this opportunity to ask another question. It was really interesting to hear you talk about how the medicalization of illness was helpful in lifting stigma, especially where you yourself kind of noted, many feminist and queer approaches to illness kind of problematize this idea of medicalization. So I'd be curious about how you saw the sort of, circulation of medical language around HIV, or you also give the example of infertility, how that worked to kind of lift value judgments made about these conditions. You gave, for example, the example of Aline, whose illness was stigmatized almost more because of her sexuality than because of her illness itself. And so I was just wondering if you could describe what this looked like kind of as a social process.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it was interesting to me again, because I think as a feminist scholar, we're often like, we've medicalized things, it's terrible, and I think it actually helped in a way because there's this notion of, I have an illness, and a lot of people would actually draw on diabetes as their example. So they would say, my illness is just like diabetes. Like a lot of people have it, you take medicine for it, and we don't blame people. So type 2 diabetes is quite common in the region. And in theory, we could blame people for that illness as well. But a lot of my interlocutors would say, like, in the same way that we shouldn't and don't blame people for this, we also shouldn't do it for HIV/AIDS. And so having it considered a medical condition and not some kind of condition of immorality really helped them. I think additionally in Lebanon, the idea that the government was providing the medication for free gave it this link of legibility in a way. So it wasn't like, you have to go do some kind of back alley deal to get your medicine, right? Like the government gave it to you. So that made it more visible and more legitimate. And people would also say, like, they expected a lot of stigma when they went to the government to get their medication. And when they were actually treated with this more bureaucratic, one of them described it to me as like, okay, name, birthday, please sit over there. And like that coldness almost actually made them feel better because it felt like people were treating it as a process and as just something that you would do the same way you might go register your license for your car. And it made it feel like it wasn't their fault. Like there's plenty of other people who were doing it also, and that the people at the government weren't stigmatizing them. And so therefore they wouldn't stigmatize themselves.
That's really interesting how the entry of the state and kind of the bureaucratization of the process of acquiring care is what helps to kind of destigmatize. And I wonder, if there has been any work done on this, or if you encountered, if you did any kind of digging on how, the entry of the state into this very personal aspect of people's lives almost helps to kind of like legitimize, having this kind of an illness.
Absolutely. And it's definitely an area that I think either I or someone should research further, this idea of the state. And it's certainly a complicated relationship, I would say, between the state and the civil society organizations and everybody working on HIV/AIDS in Lebanon. I actually encountered it, though, in a completely different realm, which is people making claims on the state in other places, so not in Lebanon, but to be recognized to get state subsidies for religion. So they, in a way, made themselves appear more Muslim in order to get these subsidies that are based on having a Muslim identity. And there's a way in which, like I was saying too, with Nguyen's work in West Africa, you have to make yourself appear to be more HIV positive, right? That's not a thing, but there's a way in which you have to make yourself legible to get this kind of treatment. So on the one hand, I think it's great and it's an interesting interaction. On the other hand, I think it can be quite challenging for people. So certainly that'd be an area to do more research in.
We have a question from Iman Nuayed. Interesting and rich study, Lizzy, thank you. Are you concerned that HIV as a social disease and patients with or at risk of HIV infection will be more marginalized, sidelined, and stigmatized with the multiple crises engulfing Lebanon? In contrast, would the collapse of state programs offer this community an opportunity to voice their concerns?
Thank you. That's a great question. So yes, certainly, I think all of these crises will make this worse. I've been in touch only briefly with some of my interlocutors since all of this, as most of them are very occupied with their own concerns following all of these crises. But certainly I've talked to one of the main doctors in my study, and you can tell that she's just beside herself with all of the, like, feeling like it was hard to care for these people to begin with, and now it's that much harder. And I think it also allows the state and any sort of power entities to be able to say we have greater concerns, you know, in the same way that you often heard in Palestine, like, we'll deal with women's issues after the revolution. I think it's easy now to say, like, after we fix the quote real problem, we can deal with your marginal issue. So unfortunately, yes. I also think that there's this, as far as subjectivity goes within the civil society activists and healthcare providers, and everyone I think living in Lebanon now, or many people, I've seen this terrible pull between wanting to stay somewhere they love and want to support and have received care and treatment as far as HIV, but we're also, it's just so hard, and it's becoming much harder because of the recent crises. So people are wondering, should I go abroad? Should I stay here? And certainly for physicians who might have more opportunity to go abroad than other people, it's a very difficult time because they want to stay and help all these people in Lebanon, and same with activists, but they're worried that it's just becoming too difficult for them personally and for their families to live there. And what was the other? With the collapse of state programs, was interesting. Perhaps so I would say that I don't know if this came through in my current talk, but that the civil society organizations have done the bulk of the work, I would say, for HIV/AIDS in Lebanon, certainly in partnership with the state. But I would say they're the ones who have done the bulk of the work from the beginning of the epidemic, and I would gather are still doing most of it, also in partnership with some physicians and other healthcare providers. So I would say yes, it probably does. And also for them, it probably feels like it's piling on to what they've already been doing.
We have another question from Kaveh Khoshnood. Apologies for joining late. You may have already discussed this, but if not, what were some of the ethical issues you encountered in your research? How did you address them?
Hi, Kaveh. Thanks for the question. So this was certainly some research fraught with ethical issues. I would actually say, though, that in the same ways that bureaucracy makes the lives of the physicians I interviewed harder, it was similar. What I mean by that is most of the concern did not come from people living with HIV/AIDS themselves or the civil society activists. They were more than happy to share their stories. They wanted people to know, even if it was anonymous. A lot of the ethical issues came more from the bureaucracy in Lebanon, who was wanting to make sure and limit my study as much as possible because of the stigma associated with these issues. So I would say that most of the people I interviewed were very excited to share their stories. About half of them wanted me to anonymize them, about half of them didn't. I anonymized everyone in the end, but they themselves didn't care. I would also say that a lot of the civil society organizations are, for better and worse, very used to making themselves legible to, let's say, like Western institutions, to research, to get funding. And so I think the anthropological sense of actually spending a long period of time with these organizations, so being there every day or many days a week for about 1.5 years, we sort of could get away from that, here's the correct bureaucratic answer that I know I'm supposed to give, to sort of seeing more how daily life was actually lived. And I would say that for me personally, you know, as an anthropologist, we're always concerned with our own positions in research. And so not being from Lebanon myself, I'm not HIV positive, I was a little bit worried that perhaps these people wouldn't want to talk to me. But I think actually the fact that I was from outside helped, because people could feel like they could tell me things. And not only would I not tell, their aunt's best friend who I know from work, but also I'd be leaving soon. So I would take it with me and it wouldn't stay. So I think that actually in the end helped them feel a little more comfortable. And finally, among a lot of my interlocutors, they had learned to talk about sexual issues in English and or French. And I think there was a bit of a disavowal from speaking of it in Lebanese Arabic. And so I think the fact that I was a native English speaker made them feel like they had a chance to talk about things that they might not usually talk about in one of their own languages. I would also say though, and you've probably found this through your own work, Kaveh, like the people who volunteer for my study are the ones who've already raised their hand. So they've already sought out civil society organizations, support groups, physicians. They volunteered for a study. They saw the flyer and they volunteered. So it's not the most vulnerable people often who unfortunately are the ones we would need to be helping the most and doing more research among.
I have another question. I wanted to kind of piggyback off of something you said earlier. You mentioned how some people living with HIV/AIDS, in order to access state services, would kind of play out their religiosity or like their Muslimness, as you said. And I was wondering if these kind of performances of piety would take place in other contexts as well, like with friends or even in front of you, people who are HIV/AIDS, HIV positive or had AIDS, would feel a need to kind of embody, this kind of pious person around friends or interlocutors, and how, living with AIDS and being religious were kind of negotiated if they're kind of seen as two seamless identities.
Great question. So let me clarify, the people who were playing up their Muslimness was not living with HIV. That was another,
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that was to get a different kind of subsidy, but it was still this, like you said, a performance of piety in a certain way that was similar to the which I saw people sort of having to play up their living with HIV. I did not encounter people who were sort of increasing their piety. I did encounter people understanding HIV perhaps as, this must have come from God in some way. He must want me to understand my life or to learn something from it, like in a positive sense. It gave them a sense of this must be the path for my life if God wants it. But I would say that the vast majority of my interlocutors were young men in their 20s and 30s, and they were either not religious at all, or they would disavow religion to an extent. I did have one who said that he thinks, while his family's not religious, that it was his certain type of like Christian ethics and morals that made his family accept him. So they knew he was gay, they knew he was HIV positive, his parents, his sister, they still accepted him and everything. And he said, he kept saying, we're not religious, but it's this idea of some kind of like morality or ethics that means you should love everybody and accept people, that made his family accept him. But yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that would be, none of my interlocutors really brought up religion, but I think that would be a very interesting further avenue for research as well.
Yeah, it seems like your a sort of social anthropology approach to HIV/AIDS in the Middle East is kind of rare, and that your work is kind of like maybe seminal.
I hope so. And it does build on a lot of so another thing I've encountered in global health literature is this idea that like, oh my gosh, we have no data for the region. Like one publication called it the black hole. And I think that's actually not true to that extent. Like, I mean, Kaveh's work in particular, but there's been a ton of work on HIV/AIDS in the region by people in the region. And I think often, again, it's just not made legible to these bigger global health bodies in ways that they can understand. And I think further, there is still this, let's say, stigma for the Middle East, right? That this is a region that's about Islam, or it's about terrorism, or these things. And these issues of sexual health are pushed to the side when actually they're very important for a lot of people. And even people not living with HIV, they're very curious about sexual health information and they want to know more, but they're not sure who to ask, or they're afraid to ask, or things like that.
So if there are no more questions, I think we can start wrapping up. Thank you so much, Lizzy, for being with us and for this very illuminating talk. I want to remind everyone who is with us today that the full calendar for the Colloquium series is on the CMES website. Our next webinar will be in about 4 weeks on Thursday, March 31st with Ian McGillivray, and he will be giving his talk entitled From Shining Star to Interventionist Actor, Turkish Foreign Policy, the Arab Spring, and State Reformation. And that will be at the same time from noon to 1. And I've linked in the chat to the link where everyone can RSVP. Okay, so thank you very much, everyone, for being here with us today.
Thank you so much, everyone.
See you next time.
Thank you.